April 8th, 1943. 27,000 feet above Caen, France. The world below was nothing but drifting white clouds and the slow heartbeat of engines. Inside the cramped cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermeken smiled behind his oxygen mask. The smirk was almost invisible, but it was there. Through the crystal canopy, he watched the heavy silhouettes climbing from the haze below. Slow, awkward, struggling shapes that seemed out of place in the thin blue air. He pressed his radio trigger. "The army has sent us flying milk bottles," he laughed to his wingman. And laughter, that day, echoed across German radios high over France. What Hermeken saw were the new American Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, the big ugly fighters making their combat debut over occupied Europe. To him, they looked ridiculous. Barrel-shaped bodies with tiny wings. Propellers so huge they seemed to twist the air itself. Machines that climbed like loaded bombers, not fighters. And yet, what he didn't know, what no German pilot circling above could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the birth of the weapon that would destroy their own air force. 18 months later, the same pilots who laughed at those milk bottles would whisper a new fad for them, Donnerschlag, thunderclap, the sound of death from above. But on that April morning, no one knew. No one could know that inside those heavy wings slept the mathematics of destruction, 8 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, firing 6,000 rounds per minute, carrying enough firepower to saw a fighter in half in less than 2 seconds. Below the German formation, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group clawed their way upward, engines roaring, wings shuddering. Each Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine spat fire and sound. 2,000 horsepower, straining against 7 tons of American steel. The men inside were new, untested, their machines unproven. Major Donald Blarley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, had flown Spitfires with the RAF just weeks earlier. He understood something his men did not yet know. Survival in the Thunderbolt meant unlearning everything they thought they knew about air combat. The Germans built for agility. The Americans built for endurance. One was a duelist's rapier, the other a hammer forged by industry. In that contrast lay the story of the war to come. The sky over France that morning was a perfect blue theatre, actors rehearsing the first act of a long tragedy. The Luftwaffe aces, veterans of Poland, France, Britain, Russia, believed they had seen everything war could offer. They were wrong, because this day, the battle was not just about flying skill or tactics. It was about philosophy, how nations build, how they fight, how they endure. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was born not from elegance but from panic. In 1940, as Europe burned, designer Alexander Kotvay received an impossible order. Build a fighter that could breathe where others suffocated. What he created was not beautiful. Even he admitted it will be a dinosaur, but a dinosaur with good proportions. That dinosaur would soon rewrite the laws of aerial warfare. In the months that followed, the Thunderbolt killed more American pilots in training than German bullets ever could. It ground-looped on landing. It rolled from torque on takeoff. It dove faster than any man expected, locking its controls as air compressed around its wings. But those who mastered it, those who survived, spoke of its power with awe. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive, said Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the farm boy from Oklahoma, who would become one of America's top aces. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. And so the stage was set. Above France, one side laughed. Below them, another side climbed. Slowly, heavily, determined. The Luftwaffe had experienced tactics, confidence. The Americans had industry, horsepower, and faith in the machine beneath them. That April day was more than just the first meeting of two aircraft. It was the collision of two worlds. Tradition against technology, finesse against force, the past against the future. No one yet knew whose philosophy would win. But the sky had already chosen its witness. The thunder was coming, and it would not be ignored. War is rarely born from calm. It begins in panic, in fear that the other side is building faster, flying higher, killing sooner. For the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, its story began in June 1940, when Europe was collapsing under the shadow of the Luftwaffe. The German fighters swept across France like wolves in formation. Their Messerschmitts owned the sky. The British were next. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched and realized with horror that its own Air Corps had nothing that could survive that kind of war. So the Army Air Force sent out an urgent specification: build us a high-altitude interceptor. They didn't ask for beauty. They asked for survival. In the Republic Aviation Plant at Farmingdale, Alexander Kartvar, a Georgian-born engineer, studied the paper on his desk. He knew the math didn't fit the dream. Lightweight interceptors couldn't carry the engines, the fuel, or the firepower America would soon need. So he designed something no one expected. Something heavy, overpowered, and ugly. When his team looked at the blueprints for what would become the XP-47B, they were stunned. It will be a dinosaur, Kartvar admitted quietly, but a dinosaur with good proportions. The prototype rolled out on May 6, 1941. It was enormous. At 900 pounds empty, it weighed more than many twin-engine bombers of just a few years earlier. And hanging off its nose was the beating heart that would make history. The Pratt & Whitney 2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of 2,000 horsepower. Behind it stretched a maze of pipes. The turbo-supercharger, a miracle of engineering that forced exhaust gases to feed power back into the machine. It looked pregnant, swollen, unbalanced. Even the test pilots hesitated. They stared at it and asked, "Does this thing actually fly?" It did. And when it reached 27,000 feet, it didn't just fly, it thrived. While other engines gasped thin air, the Double Wasp still roared with sea-level strength. For the first time, American engineers had created a fighter that could climb into the stratosphere and stay there. Powerful and unafraid. But the Thunderbolt demanded a price. It was not a machine you simply learned. It was one you survived. At Bridgeport, Connecticut, under Major Hubert Hubzaker, the 56th Fighter Group began its training. The numbers were brutal: 18 pilots dead, 41 aircraft lost between September 42 and January 1943. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would in its first months of combat. It ground-looped, on landing, flipped on takeoff, and dove so eagerly that pilots discovered a deadly new phenomenon: compressibility. At a high speed, the air itself became a wall. Controls froze. The plane refused to pull up. Many never returned. Yet those who did began to glimpse something extraordinary. The machine was honest. If you respected it, it gave you everything. As Lieutenant Robert Johnson later said, it was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. That quote became legend, because it captured what made the Thunderbolt unique. It wasn't a dancer, it was a brawler. It didn't need elegance. It needed a target. When the first squadrons crossed the Atlantic in early 1943, morale was mixed. The British, flying their sleek Spitfires, looked at the massive American fighters and smirked. They called them flying milk bottles and joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit. The Germans agreed. In their reports, the Thunderbolt was meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow, wrote Hutchman, SF Pips Priller of Jagdgeschwades after his first encounter. Their confidence seemed justified by the numbers the Americans were losing. 14 Thunderbolts gone in the first month, for only 3 confirmed kills. The Luftwaffe laughed. But underneath those statistics, something was shifting. The Thunderbolt was absorbing punishment that should have killed any aircraft. Planes riddled with cannon fire were limping home with wings shredded, engines still turning, pilots alive. Mechanics counted over 100 bullet holes in a single plane. And yet it landed. For the first time, the Americans realized what they had built. Not a duelist's blade, but an armored fist. A flying fortress in miniature. A machine that could take a beating, give one back, and still make it home in time for dinner. That understanding changed everything. Major Deska and his pilots began rewriting their own manual. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. This wasn't the war of Spitfires and dogfights anymore. It was the war of horsepower, altitude, and endurance. The Americans were beginning to fight in their own language. Industrial logic translated into air combat. They would never match the Germans' elegance in design. They didn't have to. They just had to outlast them. And high above France, that philosophy was about to be tested for the first time. April 8th, 1943. The date that began it all. The laughter of Ralph Herpmation still echoed through the static of German radios. Below, 16 Thunderbolts climbed steadily into history, their engines straining, their pilots sweating, their commander knowing that today would change everything. That morning wasn't just the debut of a new aircraft. It was the quiet turning of an era, from speed to strength, from agility to resilience, from art to industry. And though the men inside those P-47s didn't yet know it, they were about to prove that in a world at war, sometimes the heaviest thing in the sky is hope itself. The first time the Germans stopped laughing, it was because of one man. June 26th, 1943, over Lazo, France. The morning began like any other escort mission. 48 P-47s of the 61st Fighter Squadron returning home after guarding bombers. They were tired, low on fuel, relaxed. And that was when the Wolves ate. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s, the pride of Jagdgeschwader 26, dived from the sun. Their leader, Headman Wilhelm-Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of Adolf Galland, at the front. The Germans had done this dance 100 times before. Speed, precision, kill, vanish. They expected it to be quick. But war that day had other plans. At the tail of the American formation flew Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson? He was 22. A farm boy from Oklahoma with freckles and faith in the machine beneath him. When the first cannon shells hit, he didn't even see them coming. The cockpit erupted in fire and glass. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his face. Shrapnel tore into his leg. He tried to bail out, but the canopy rail was jammed, but welded shut by an exploding shell. He was trapped inside a dying airplane at 27,000 feet. Johnson later wrote that he prayed not to live, but to die quickly. But the Thunderbolt refused to die. It shuddered, shook, and somehow leveled itself. Half blind, bleeding, Johnson pointed the nose toward England. The engine coughed, then caught, and kept turning. A few minutes later, a lone Focke-Wulf 190 appeared behind him. The German pilot was alone, out of the fight. scanning for survivors. Then he saw the crippled P-47 limping east. He lined up his guns and opened fire. 20mm shells exploded across Johnson's fuselage. The Thunderbolt didn't fall. The Germans circled, fired again, machine guns this time, his cannons empty. Still, the Thunderbolt flew. He pulled alongside, close enough for Johnson to see his face. Young, blonde, confident, turned slowly to disbelief. He saluted, then banked away. Out of ammunition, out of understanding. Johnson's aircraft landed at Manston with its engine sputtering and its skin torn like paper. The crew stopped counting bullet holes after 200. And still, the machine had flown. That day, both sides learned something new. The Americans had built a monster that wouldn't die. The report spread through every squadron like wildfire. Pilots who had cursed the Thunderbolt's weight now saw it as armor. Mechanics began calling it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. It fit. By July, tactics were changing. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zucker, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, wrote new rules on the chalkboard. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them, low. Dive. Hit. Climb away. They called it the boom and zoom. Simple. Brutal. Effective. At 30,000 feet, the P-47 was untouchable. It could dive faster than any German fighter alive. A Thunderbolt dropping from the sun hit speeds of 550 miles per hour. Faster than the sound barrier allowed them to admit. The Germans couldn't follow. When the foe tried, their wings tore. August 15th, 1943, Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The deepest penetration of bombers into Germany, yet attempted. And the day the Luftwaffe learned what the Thunderbolt's guns could really do. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, spotted a formation of Messerschmitt 110s, preparing to attack the bombers. Twin-engine destroyers, heavy and confident, built to kill bombers. Schilling rolled his 4 Thunderbolts into a dive from 28,000 feet. A German gunner, Heinrich Roth, remembered. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. The one ahead of us didn't just go down, it exploded. Wings, tail, everything gone. In less than a minute, 8 German aircraft were destroyed. They didn't fall, they disintegrated. That was the moment German pilots began to fear the sound of 8 Brownings speaking at once. Each P-47 carried 300 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, nearly 900 pounds of bullets. At convergence range, 6 feet across, every trigger pull created a storm. 100 half-inch projectiles per second, tearing through aluminum, fuel, and flesh. German reports described it simply. The American fighters do not fire bursts. They pour out continuous streams of fire. The Thunderbolt's battery had turned into the most efficient killing machine in the sky. Autumn brought new lessons. The Luftwaffe's top ace, Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, with 206 victories to his name, faced the P-47 over Bremont, France. On October 8th, 1943, he led his Jagdschwader ein into the thin air at 28,000 feet. His BMW 801 engine wheezed, gasping for oxygen. Then the sky above him darkened. It wasn't clouds. It was thunderbolts. Robert Johnson, now an experienced killer, spotted Philipp's distinct Fokker-Wulf with its nose art gleaming in the sun. He turned, lined up his guns, and fired at 300 yards. Strikes flashed along the German fuselage. The aircraft exploded. No parachute. The death of Hans Philipp sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If one of their best couldn't survive, what chance did the rest have? The High Command ordered an immediate analysis of the new American fighter. The findings were grim. Service ceiling above 42,000 feet, dive speeds near the sound barrier, armor thick enough to shrug off cannon fire. The report's final line was chilling. Enemy fighter unsinkable in direct engagement. But the Americans weren't finished improving. In January 1944, the P-47 D-22 arrived, with the massive paddle blade propeller. Each blade was 13 feet long, wide and curved like an axe. The change transformed the fighter overnight. Climb rate jumped to 3,000 feet per minute. Acceleration improved by a third. And the sound changed. German troops on the ground began to hear it before they saw it. A deep, rolling thunder that shook the earth. They named it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. The sound of inevitability. Spring brought longer wings than external tanks. By March 1944, Thunderbolts could escort bombers deep into Germany, over 1,000 miles. When the Luftwaffe tried to strike, they met walls of heavy fighters waiting above, below, and beside the bombers. No escape, no mercy. The laughter that had filled German radios in 1943 had vanished. Now there was only static and fear. The Thunderbolt had done more than survive. It had evolved. What began as a clumsy experiment had become a weapon of industrial perfection. And every time those 8 guns spoke, the balance of power tilted further west. By the summer of 1944, the world overhaul belonged to the Jug. But its true transformation, from fighter to destroyer, was just beginning. The story that started with a smirk in the cockpit of a Fokker-Wulf was about to end with thunder over Normandy. War reveals more than machines. It reveals men. And the story of the Thunderbolt is not only about horsepower and bullets, it is about the people who climbed inside those steel giants, strapped themselves to explosions, and called it flying. After that June morning over Lazo, something shifted among the Americans. They began to believe, not in luck, but in their aircraft and in one another. When Robert Johnson limped home, bloodied and half blind, the entire 56th Fighter Group gathered around his wrecked plane. Mechanics, officers, cooks, clerks, all stared at the bullet-riddled fuselage. One of them whispered, "If that thing can fly, so can we." From then on, the Thunderbolt became more than a machine. It was a promise. A guardian angel made of rivets and oil. In the months that followed, courage took many shapes. It was Major Hubert's scar, standing before his men, chalk dust on his hands, teaching them how to fight differently. "Don't play their game," he said. "Play ours." He taught them to trust in physics, not pride. To fight with patience, not panic. And every time a pilot returned alive, that lesson deepened. It was Captain Walker Bard Mahurin, diving through cloud at 500 miles per hour, closing on enemy fighters so fast that time itself seemed to bend. He called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. His voice, calm in the radio static. Don't dogfight. Drop, strike, climb. Simple words that saved dozens of lives. And it was the ground crews, the unsung half of every victory. They worked in mud and freezing rain, sleeves rolled up, hands black with oil, rebuilding shattered aircraft piece by piece. A pilot might fly one Thunderbolt in the morning, and another by dusk, freshly patched, refueled, and ready. They called themselves armorers of angels. Every dent hammered, every bullet replaced, was an act of quiet defiance. One mechanic at Manston kept a bullet he pulled from Johnson's engine block. He wore it on a chain around his neck for the rest of the war. When asked why, he said, "It's not a bullet, It's a heartbeat that kept going. On the German side, courage looked different, but no less human. Many Luftwaffe pilots began to understand what they were facing long before Berlin did. Some admired the Americans' resolve, others feared it. A few even saluted their opponents in mid-air, a gesture of respect from one condemned man to another. In February 1944, Headman Heinz Knocker of Jagdschwader 11 recorded in his diary, "We laughed at them once. We thought their planes were fat, clumsy, absurd. Today we climb to meet them, and they climb with us. When they fire, the sky turns to metal. My friend Schmidt was hit. He ceased to exist. These are not the same machines we mocked." Even in fear, Knocker's words carried respect. The battlefield had become a conversation written in fire between equals. The Thunderbolt changed the way Americans saw themselves too. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of transformation. A nation that had entered the war untested now fielded men who could fight, endure, and learn faster than anyone imagined. Young men who had never seen combat became legends overnight. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, once a farm boy, was now an ace. Major David Schilling, once a student pilot, led missions deep into enemy skies. Each name carried the same story, fear-faced and conquered. But courage wasn't only in victory. It was in the quiet moments, the long flights home over the channel, the empty seats in the mess hall, the letters that never arrived. Every pilot knew the odds. They joked, they sang, they drank, but when they climbed into the cockpit, the world became very small. Just a man, a machine, and the sky. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is flying through it, engine shaking, heart pounding, hands steady on the throttle. One radio operator later said, "The sound of those R-2800s at dawn, it was like hearing thunder roll across the earth. You knew someone was about to risk everything." The Germans had courage too, and like Hans Philipp, who fought 500 missions before dying in one burst of gunfire. Men who flew knowing their odds had turned to zero. Even when their commanders lied to them about victory, they took off anyway. Because pride, duty, and habit can carry a man even when hope cannot. As Major G.A. Rao later recalled after surviving a Thunderbolt attack, "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone laughed, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody laughed 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche. Their guns didn't stutter. They roared. Getting caught in that stream meant instant death." His words were not just fear. They were respect for the enemy's efficiency, for the ruthless precision of American firepower. There is a quiet heroism in survival. For every ace with medals, there were dozens of unknown pilots who simply made it home. They fought the wind, the cold, the odds. They counted bullet holes in their wings and thanked whoever was listening. The Thunderbolt gave them that chance to survive, to fly another day. When the bombers returned from Germany, the ground crews would count the missing. Sometimes it was silence that hit hardest. An empty bunk. A name wiped from a locker. The Thunderbolt might be invincible, but the men were not. Still, they climbed in again the next morning. Because courage, in its truest form, is repetition. It is getting up again and again when the sky keeps trying to kill you. In those days, courage had the sound of engines warming in the dark, the smell of oil and cordite, the thump of boots on metal ladders, and the quiet prayer whispered before every takeoff. The Thunderbolt may have been born from industry, but it was kept alive by men. Men of flesh and doubt and impossible resolve. And though the war would make them legends, it also made them something simpler, something purer. Human beings who learned that sometimes the heaviest burden a man can carry is the weight of coming home. By the time winter arrived in 1944, The laughter that had once filled German cockpits had vanished. In its place came silence and the thunder. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had become more than a fighter. It was an instrument of industrial will, a flying embodiment of America's relentless production and persistence. Every roar of its R-2800 double Wasp was a reminder. This was not just one plane. It was the voice of a factory, of a nation that refused to stop building. March 1944. The new paddle-blade Thunderbolts filled the skies over Europe. With external fuel tanks slung beneath their wings, they could now escort bombers deep into Germany, past the Rhine, past the factories, all the way to the heart of the Reich. At altitude, they were kings. Below them, the Luftwaffe was bleeding to death. German reports from that spring read like obituaries. Entire squadrons, Jagdgeschwader 11, 26, 54, reduced to shadows. The more they fought, the faster they vanished. A single P-47 could now outclimb, outdive, and outshoot almost anything Germany could put in the air. And when the battle turned downward, the Thunderbolt revealed its second nature, the destroyer of the ground. In April 1944, Allied planners shifted strategy. As this invasion of France drew near, the P-47 was assigned a new mission: break the enemy's spine before the troops ever landed. The same 8 Brownings that had shredded fighters now tore apart trains, tanks, and trucks. Pilots called it tank plinking. But to those below, it was terror. A single 2-second burst from a Thunderbolt put 160 half-inch projectiles into an area the size of a truck. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds ignited fuel, shattered steel, and turned convoys into burning skeletons. Later variants carried 2 1,000-pound bombs and 10 5-inch HVR rockets, each equivalent to an artillery shell. To the men of the 5th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, who faced them in Normandy, the effect was beyond comprehension. They came in low, recalled Hans von Luck, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring, rockets screaming, machine guns hammering. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles gone. The ground itself shook. The word Jabo, fighter bomber, entered German vocabulary as a curse. But the soldiers gave it a truer name: Fliegende Artillerie, flying artillery. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Thunderbolts created a wall of sky. More than 500 P-47s guarded the beaches, layer upon layer, from sea level to 30,000 feet. German fighters that tried to break through were slaughtered. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader 1 was one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that day. He later reported, "The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from the water to the clouds. We tried at dawn, 12 of us. I was the only one to return." From that moment on, the Luftwaffe never truly recovered. The air above Normandy became an American kingdom. In the weeks that followed, Thunderbolts crippled Germany's ability to move. Statistics from the 9th Air Force were staggering: 651 locomotives, 3,047 trucks, 512 tanks, 4,550 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed in a single month. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, crawling through shadows while P-47s waited for dawn. German ground troops developed a new superstition. If they heard the deep rolling thunder of a double Wasp, they froze. Veterans called it Jabo fever. Even hardened men grew sick with dread before missions, if Thunderbolts were reported nearby. It wasn't cowardice, it was survival instinct. By late 1944, the Thunderbolts legend had spread beyond Europe. Across the Pacific, Pacific. Colonel Neil Kirby and his 348th Fighter Group flew P-47s over New Guinea and the Philippines. They discovered the same truth their comrades in Europe had learned. The Thunderbolt could take punishment that would have killed any other fighter. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai described it simply. We called them monsters. Our 20-UMO cannon could destroy a P-40 in seconds, but the Thunderbolt, it just kept flying. I hit one dozens of times. It flew away. Its return fire tore planes apart. To the Japanese, it was a new kind of enemy. Mechanical, unbreakable, relentless. To the Americans, it was proof that their design philosophy worked anywhere, on any front. Back in Europe, 1945 arrived in fire and ruin. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet had entered the war, sleek, fast, and untouchable in theory. But even jets were not safe from the thunder. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meir of the 352nd Fighter Group shot one down on November 27, 1944, diving for 8,000 feet. His report was clinical. Opened fire at 400 yards. Enemy aircraft disintegrated. Pilot did not escape. 8 synchronized Browning. 50s had done what cannon shells could not, ended a jet with pure density of fire. By March 1945, specialized P-47M models appeared. Faster, higher, deadlier. Thunderbolts were now intercepting jets, rockets, and even V-1 flying bombs. The ski once ruled by the Luftwaffe now belonged to American steel and courage. Then came Operation Bodenplatte, January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe's desperate strike against Allied airfields. Nearly 900 German fighters attacked at dawn, catching some units by surprise. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, 22 Thunderbolts burned. For a moment, the Germans celebrated. A captured pilot was brought before Major George Brooking of the 365th Fighter Group. Pointing to the wreckage, the Germans sneered. What do you think of that? Brooking pointed toward the runway where ground crews were already pushing aside the remains. By tomorrow, he said, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots? The Germans' smirk disappeared. 48 hours later, brand new P-47s filled the line. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, had lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots, men it could never replace. That was the war in a single exchange. Industry against exhaustion, youth against attrition, abundance against desperation. By the end, the statistics spoke louder than propaganda ever could. Republic Aviation built 15,683 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter. At peak, a new one rolled off the line every hour. Factories at Farmingdale and Evansville ran day and night, turning aluminum, copper, and sweat into freedom. The engine alone had 2,400 parts, machined to perfection by workers, many of them women, who had never touched an airplane before the war. Ammunition plants, like Lake City Arsenal, produced 30 million rounds a month to feed the Thunderbolt's hunger. Fuel tankers crossed the Atlantic like lifelines, carrying the blood that kept the giant alive. The numbers were overwhelming, but behind them were people. Every rivet placed by a worker in New York, every bullet pressed in Missouri, every gallon of fuel shipped across submarine-infested waters. Each one was part of the same fight. The Thunderbolt wasn't just an aircraft. It was the sum of a nation's labor. To the Germans who survived, it became a symbol of futility and, strangely, respect. In March 1945, the same Josef Priller, who once called the Thunderbolt a pregnant cow, gave an interview to propaganda officers. His statement was suppressed for being too honest. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a fighter. But beyond the machine, it represents what we could never match. Unlimited production, unlimited training, unlimited fuel. We lose one, it's gone forever. They lose 10, they build 20. Courage without resources is only delayed defeat. That, more than any statistic, was the truth of the air war. By April in 1945, the Luftwaffe was a ghost. Its pilots barely trained, its airfields craters, its fuel gone. Those who still flew described their missions as suicide. Young men like Klaus Brechender lasted 12 seconds in combat before meeting the Thunderbolts. The sky rained burning aluminum and bodies, he recalled. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was an ending. When the war finally fell silent, the numbers were carved into history. 3,052 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 315 more on the ground, 26,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks. Each figure was a consequence of 8 synchronized Brownings and the men who knew how to use them. The Luftwaffe lost 28,000 pilots fighting the Western Allies. The average German had 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had over 200. The result was inevitable. And yet, within that inevitability lies the lesson. War is not won by brilliance alone. It is won by preparation, by endurance, by the belief that no matter how many times you are struck, you can build again. The Thunderbolt proved that idea in aluminum and blood. It taught a generation that survival itself could be a weapon. That power, when guided by discipline and humanity, can defend freedom rather than destroy it. When the thunder finally faded, what remained was not arrogance but gratitude for the men who flew, for those who fell, and for the people who built a machine so strong it gave others a chance to live. As one pilot said years later, "Every time I hear that deep rumble, I don't think of war. I think of the boys who didn't come back, and the machine that tried to bring them home." When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the skies over Europe were empty but not quiet. The echoes of engines, the smell of burned fuel, the ghosts of vapor trails, they lingered, suspended between memory and history. Among the wreckage and ruins, one shape remained unmistakable. Barrel-bodied, wide-winged, unapologetically American. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It had entered the war as a joke, and ended it as a legend. The same pilots who once called it clumsy now called it home. The same enemies who mocked it whispered its name with respect, even fear. And the same sky that once mocked its weight now carried its echo. A deep, rolling thunder that meant freedom had returned. Today, a single P-47D rests inside the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Polished, silent, proud. Beneath its wings sits a glass case containing 2 things: a strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 190 exploding mid-air, and a handful of spent 50 caliber shells. Dull brass, blackened by history. A small plaque bears a quote taken from a 1945 interrogation of a German pilot. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to. They just pointed those guns, and you ceased to exist." Those words, cold and simple, outlived the war itself. But the true legacy of the Thunderbolt isn't metal, it's memory. It's in the stories told quietly at reunions, where men who once fought on opposite sides shake hands beneath museum lights. It's in the sound of old engines starting on airfields during air shows. Children cover their ears and veterans close their eyes. For a moment, they are back in the cockpit, 22 years old, the sky wide open, the world uncertain, the thunder beneath their feet. General Adolf Galland, who once commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, said it best in 1985, standing before an audience in Phoenix, Arizona. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We laughed at this big, heavy fighter and said the Americans didn't understand air combat. We were wrong. They didn't build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survival. And they built 15,000 of them." Then he paused. "When I flew a captured P-47 after the war," he said, "I understood everything. It climbed like it was falling upward. It was a pilot's aircraft, wrapped in armor. And those guns, once you heard them, you never forgot the sound. That sound, the voice of Roosevelt's piano, as the Germans called it, became the anthem of a new kind of war. A war where courage met industry, where survival became strength, and where laughter turned to awe. The Thunderbolt story is not just about victory, it is about transformation. It proved that genius does not always wear the sleek lines of elegance. Sometimes it comes dressed in armor and noise and sheer determination. It showed that power, when guided by discipline, could be a force for protection, not destruction. And it reminded the world that even in the darkest hour, innovation and resolve could outlast fear. Every rivet in its frame carried a fingerprint. Every flight carried a life. Every return landing, no matter how battered, was a miracle of will. The men who flew it are gone now, or nearly so. Their names etched into granite, their laughter fading into the static of history. But the sky remembers, because the sky never forgets the sound of thunder. When a Thunderbolt engine starts today, it's more than machinery. It's memory made alive. The propeller spins, air trembles, and for a heartbeat, time folds. Somewhere, in that deep metallic rumble, you can still hear the laughter that began it all. The arrogance of a young German ace in 1943, and the answering silence that followed when the thunder spoke. The war ended. The laughter died. But the lesson remained. Strength built on faith. Power guided by purpose. And the unbreakable truth that in the struggle between destruction and endurance, endurance always wins. The Thunderbolt's wings may rest now, but its story still flies. Through the roar of engines at air shows, through the voices of historians, through the quiet pride of those who build, repair, and remember. Because history, like flight, is not just about how high you go, but how many times you climb again after falling. And somewhere above the clouds, in that eternal blue where all battles finally end, the thunder still echoes, steady, strong, and free. If you've listened this far, maybe you understand why stories like this still matter. The Thunderbolt wasn't just an airplane, it was a generation's heartbeat, cast in steel and courage. And the men who flew her weren't just soldiers. They were ordinary kids who learned how to do impossible things because history asked them to. Every rivet in that aircraft was placed by hands that believed tomorrow was worth building. Every bullet loaded, every engine started, every mission flown, each was a small vote for the world we live in now. So when you see a restored P-47 at an air show, or hear that deep, rolling growl in the distance, take a second to listen. Not just with your ears, but with your heart. Because that sound isn't just thunder. It's memory. It's defiance. It's freedom, paid for in courage. If this story moved you, share it. Tell someone younger why these machines, These men and their sacrifices still echo across time. Visit a museum.
Shake the hand of a veteran if you can.
Say their names out loud, so they are never just footnotes in a textbook. History only lives as long as we keep telling it. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Thunderbolt. That long after the engine stopped, the story still flies. Because freedom is not quiet. It has a sound. A deep, rolling rumble that reminds the world. The thunder once spoke, and the sky still remembers.